it's just really fascinating. Chapter 3, verse 1, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good. Now, we've seen variations of this sort of command in, 1 Peter chapter 2, Romans chapter 13. But I think it's just struck me again because chapter 3, verse 1 comes right after chapter 2, verse 15. Chapter 2, verse 15 says, encourage and rebuke with all authority. Do not let anyone despise you. Remind the people to be subject, and chapter 3, verse 1 now, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities.
Mm.
And it just got me thinking because there's a lot of, say, Christian commentators who have a very high suspicion of authorities and, whenever the government is trying to tell us to do something, especially right now with coronavirus restrictions and whatnot, resist what the government is saying, this, that, and whatever. And yet Titus is saying, encourage and rebuke with all authority, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient. And so I don't really have a concluding thought here at this point. I just thought it was fascinating and I wanted to raise it and to ask what you had to think about or had to say about this.
Yeah, look, I mean, reading some of those attributes in chapter 2 and then you get a particular vibe of what kind of person Paul wants Christians to be, in a sense. Like, encourage young men to be self-controlled. In your teaching, show integrity, seriousness, soundness of speech. So anyone who opposes you would be ashamed because they've got nothing bad to say about us. We wait for the blessed hope. We're eager to do what is good. There's a certain, I think the word, maybe the word I'm looking for is meekness. There's a certain meekness and a willingness to submit ourselves to others, whether it's a teacher or a spiritual authority or God or government authority. There should be a willingness to submit, which I think is not necessarily seen as a virtue in our current culture, although that's obviously a very generic thing to say. There are pockets of people who would see it as a vice to be inclined to submit to authorities. And it's, seen as a virtue by a lot of people to have this instinct of, there's an authority, let me see how I can be disobedient to them and show how my moral code or my intelligence is superior to theirs, and so subvert them. I think that's that's an unchristian way to kind of go about life. Now, obviously, there are examples of legitimate problems that we might have with authorities, but as that should, our inclination should not be to not submit. Our inclination should be to submit to authorities. Yeah. Yeah. Those are some thoughts. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think I'm just really reminded and struck by the fact that Paul and Peter were talking about, submitting and being obedient to authorities in the midst of persecution, in the midst of hardship. I read and listen quite widely across the political spectrum. When I listen to some supposedly Christian voices talking about relationship to government, I'm going, I can't imagine that Paul or Peter would be impressed with this. Saying that masks and vaccines are oppressive. Meanwhile, Paul and Peter were seeing brothers and sisters dragged into prison,
Mm.
you know, ripped apart in the Colosseum. And yet they still say, submit to the authorities. Now, submitting to the authorities didn't mean letting go of your faith.
Mm.
But I guess on one level, what it did mean is being willing to suffer the consequences of what, like it's not as if the Christians were called to fight back against those who were taking them to prison.
Mm.
So there's just a disconnect in my mind when I listen to or read these commentators or these people writing articles or Facebook posts and just going, you sound more worldly conservative than Christian biblical.
Mm.
And there is a difference.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think just one thing on that though, with the whole mask and vaccine, the opposition to mask and vaccine that you see from, I don't know what the right, I don't want to label, but, a radical right in which like evangelical Christians are often, equated with or caught up with. There is a difference though in terms of our climate and what, you talk about the violent persecutions in the early church. Like, I don't think anyone's necessarily taking up sword. Do you know what I mean? Like, even in Sydney, no one's putting forward the idea of violent disobedience. Like, even the protesters, wanted the majority wanted a non-violent protest. So I'm cautious to kind of draw the connection between early church kind of obedience and contrasting that with people voicing frustrations and anger with the government now as like disobedience. Is that the kind of disobedience that Paul had in mind? Yeah, I don't know.
No, it's a helpful comment and corrective there, yeah, because within our government system, we do have provisions for protesting. We do have provisions for being able to let your voice in opposition to things be heard. That's true. No, that's a helpful thing to point out there. I guess going back to what you said before, it's more the attitude that you come with, right? Do you come with one that is seeking to be obedient and submissive to the governments, to the rulers, or you coming ready to point out that you're not happy with what's being done?
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of what submission looks like, right? Like, if you think about the way in which we submit to Christ, and I know it's different because the way we submit to Christ is different to the way we should submit to governments and rulers and whatnot. But it's more than just obeying what Jesus says. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just, Jesus tells me I should put sin to death and seek to grow in gentleness. It's more than just going, all right, I hate this. I think this is the stupidest command that Jesus has ever come up with, but I gotta do it anyway. Okay. Like, that might be obedience, but that's not the right attitude that we should have with Jesus.
Yes. Yep. I agree with that. But what about this? Do you think it's ever okay? Do you let's say that someone is a Christian and wants to submit to Jesus, wants to submit to the Bible, doesn't believe the science on masks, thinks it's silly that people have to wear masks outside. So they think it doesn't make sense. Should that person just do it anyway because the government said to do it? I think yes. I think there are situations where you disagree with an authority, you think what they say is silly, but you do it anyway. Because it's better to forego what you think makes sense and to do what's actually been commanded, because that's more in line with humility, with love for other people, even if it's just loving people who have a different idea of what is the go with the science, yeah.
No, I agree with that. In lieu of seeing something as good and beautiful, you should go with it because it's true, or it's true of what you've been commanded to do. But I think that you don't want to stay there. Like when it comes to, so just going back to commands that Jesus gives us, it's not enough to just do what he says because he says it, because that will only get you so far, and it's a very poor motivator. But to know that it is a good and beautiful thing that pleases God, that is more compelling. And it's also more important in the way you talk about it and seek to teach others. I remember one time I threw the line out that, I'm called to teach what the Bible teaches, even if I don't like it. And someone called me out on that. A minister called me out on that and said, well, I understand what you're trying to say, James, but actually you should seek to grow to like it as well.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe then going to what you were saying with masks, I think yes, but just as a general attitude when it comes to governments and rulers, it's not just to do what they say begrudgingly, but to try to understand and see the goodness of aligning yourself with what the government is saying.
But I think that there is a distinction to make between human authorities and Jesus. Like,
that's true.
It's like if Jesus is God, he will never lie. He'll never be wrong. So his commands will be good and will be lovable, and we should try to love and grow in understanding them. There will, though, be sometimes when human authorities will give a command that actually will be wrong.
Yes, agreed.
But that doesn't mean that you don't follow it. There are certain situations where you shouldn't follow it, where those commands contradict with the commands of God. But our I guess that's a question that you ask, but your default should be obedience to that command, even if you don't really agree with that command.
Yeah, there you go.